The start of this year's Everyday Inclusion Live. I am Mo Berkner Boyd, the founder of the Moxie Exchange and the Everyday Inclusion app. I'm a white woman, red hair, kind of mid-length. I need to get it cut. Um, I'm rocking some slightly cat-eye glasses, got my bookshelf behind me. And it's always good to start the year with a refresher for anybody that might be new to the series. It's all about community. It's about a community of people that are learning together, growing together, staying curious together about how to create cultures of belonging. And so the series, I bring on really cool people like Rosie to share their expertise so that we can all learn together. So, Rosie, you get to kick off the year. Rosie was a panelist at our EI Cubed conference, our inaugural conference back in the fall. And I tapped her on the shoulder afterward and I said, I need you on the series. So here we are. Rosie, please introduce yourself. And I can't wait for this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Mo. I am such a big fan of everyday inclusion and the Moxie Exchange. And my name is Rosie. I am the statewide equity director for the state of Colorado. And my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I have been working in the EDIA space for almost 10 years operationally. And then as a woman of color, my whole life. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today.
Well, and there's going to be a couple of things, even just from your intro. The order with which you threw out the alphabet of this work is going to be one of the things that we talk about for sure. Um, Tell me how you got started. I think I always feel like people's origin story, like superheroes in the work, is really interesting. So what led you to this path?
Yeah, I think my why is pretty twofold. My mom is a woman of color. I'm biracial. I'm half white and half black. And my mom was a single mom that grew up during the civil rights movement uh, in a little segregated town in Ohio. And as a Black woman, this EDIA, before it was called EDIA, EDIB, EDIJ, was always a topic of conversation amongst us. She was one of eight in this little town. And when I would go to try out for volleyball, I would say, "Hey, mom, like, did you play volleyball? Like, what sports did you play in high school?" And she said, "Baby, I wasn't allowed to."
Mhm.
And despite all of the many barriers that were put in place, there are still to this day ice cream shops that in this same town that my mom and family will not go to um, in 2023. And despite all of the many barriers that were put in place for my grandma, who was also a single mom, and my mom, I have this picture of my four aunts because there were four girls and four boys, and I always point to them as my inspiration for this work because, and then in front of the four aunts and my mom, or the three aunts and my mom, there's me like, and and as like a little 8-year old, and my aunt Joan became a caretaker for the elderly. My aunt Robin became a social worker. And my aunt Lois became a teacher for those with disabilities. And my mom became a retired FBI agent. And so, despite the many barriers and the many people that told these little girls of color that they could not do, that they were not seen, they said, "Shh, let me show you,
Watch me.
watch me." And that has always been incredibly inspiring for me. But again, because that was my mom's lived experience, and because she was the one Black female, the one female, the one this, the one that, in so many different rooms, having DEIA conversations just became the norm in our household. It was just so natural for us to have these conversations. And so when I was graduating from undergrad, I I wanted to work in public service, but I also wanted to work in the fashion industry. It was like this very strange dichotomy. And I ended up going into the fashion industry, but I worked in human resources, and I had interned in a creative field. And then they said, "Hey, Rosie, it's 2010. We don't have a creative position open right now, but we do have a position opened up in HR. Is that something you'd be interested in?" And so started working in the fashion industry in human resources. I worked for two brands under Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy in New York City. And while I was doing that, I was spending a lot of my personal time on the public service side. And I was volunteering and I was traveling and still having these conversations with my mom. And I ended up leaving my very competitive fashion job, which my whole family was like, please don't. And I joined the Peace Corps. And so I went and served in the Peace Corps in the country of Namibia. I taught sixth, seventh, and eighth grade English in a little tiny village called Omusheshe. I dreamed about Omusheshe last night, which is really interesting. I can have a very, very small conversation with anyone that speaks Oshivambo, which is a tribal language of Bantu. And it changed everything for me. And so that really became kind of my first immersive experience in cultural competency or humility. And specifically because a lot of things that happen amongst Peace Corps or the challenges were just like a communication cultural, like, hey, maybe we should talk about this instead of making assumptions kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I was a part of the group that was able to get the first DEI council for that country. And it was really, really special. And so when I came back to the United States, I started working at Mile High United Way. And they were beginning a lot of their internal EDI things. And they asked me to be a part of it. And I said, absolutely. Again, I've been talking about this my whole life. We can talk about this at work now. We're good. Great. Awesome. Sign me up. And so worked at Mile High United Way, again, in an HR capacity, which I never thought my fashion HR days would lead me into HR again. And then I worked for the city of Colorado Springs doing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then this position with the state asked me to join, and I said, absolutely, I want to be a part of this more than anything. And so it's been a really, really amazing journey to again, take all of these ideas and feelings and hearts and minds and operationalizing them into systemic change, which is really what we try to do at the state. So it's been super exciting to be a part of this.
So y'all, just so you know, I did not know Rosie's backstory, all of that. That wasn't like a plant question. But that's one of the best stories ever.
I just remember I had been volunteering and kind of traveling abroad while I was waiting to go into Peace Corps. And I was sitting down in Buenos Aires with my Spanish instructor. And she said, like, are you okay? Like, are you going? Like, is this like a sabbatical? Like these are two different worlds. And I'm like, I'm well aware it's intentional. How do I say that in Spanish?
Right. Well, and I think, right, the arc of all of this, right, leading you to statewide equity
Yeah.
Where is the state in the journey?
Ooh, we are moving. We are, the work in EDIA is never over. Um, but we have some incredible practitioners on our team that are some of my favorite people in the world. We have 4 programmatic areas in the statewide equity office that specifically focus on equity. The first is supplier diversity. So we are working with women and minority owned businesses through the procurement process to really create um, for economic growth. We have statewide accessibility, and we are working on things like transition plans for the state, accommodations. The state is sensational because they are really putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we could not be more grateful. And so we have an accommodations fund for agencies where if there is an accommodations request and money is a barrier to them, they can get reimbursed through our office to create the accommodation for folks. We have internal strategy, which is kind of your workforce EDIA. And so we're working with multiple agencies. So we sit in the Department of Personnel Administration, and we help strategize amongst all of the 20 agencies. And it's kind of 20 plus in the state on their EDI initiatives. And so we do things like equity audit assessments. We look at policies and procedures. We try to strategize long term what EDIA can look like for an agency, because again, we're asking to solve these very big things like racism in a 5-year plan. Like, so so we really help look at those plans with folks. And then we have community engagement. And community engagement is a core pillar or value of the statewide equity office, because we really believe that to be informed in what we do, we have to speak with community first. And so we're currently creating communities of practice across our 4 programmatic areas where if you are a community member, maybe you are a person with a disability and you have experienced something across the state that could just look a little bit differently, we want to hear your voice because that voice is valued and it's heard, and we can't make the right systematic changes unless we hear from community. And so we really listen to community through our communities of practice. We help understand what the issues are, and then we funnel that information back into the change makers, which is really cool to watch all play out.
Yeah, as I'm thinking about these 4, right? It's like this full system, right? From who the state is doing business with,
right?
Accessibility, internally, what you're doing, bring community member voice in, right? Like that all back. That is fantastic. Talk about, if you would, you say EDIA.
You do.
And I think that is really important for, right? So your equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's an intentional choice. And I think it's always very interesting and telling why the choice is made, in what order, and what's included. Can you just talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, so we actually sat down as a team and said, how do we want to represent the work that we do? We ultimately all understand equity is at the core of it. And that has to be where we put our effort into things. But we intentionally wanted to add the A to our work, because sometimes there are accessibility practitioners that get left out of the EDI conversations, and they're doing equity work too. And so we wanted to make sure that they were seen as a part of the work that we're doing.
So Rosie, what are some of the things that are working, right? What are some of the best practices that when you're talking to other people doing the work, you say, hey, here, you might take this page from our book?
Yeah. Yeah. I love this question because, again, we have a phenomenal team at the state, and I learn something from them new every single day. And their um, their hearts are so contagiously passionate about what we do. And so I think, of course, hearts and minds are an area that we work on in terms of exposure and training. One of my favorite things, I come from an EDI kind of like training, organizational development background. And my favorite part about equity trainings are not the trainings themselves. I think the content is fabulous. I think it's wonderful. And I always learn something fabulous. My favorite part about an equity, diversity, and inclusion and accessibility training is the proverbial water cooler conversation afterwards.
Yes. Yes.
The time when there are people on the elevator and they're like, did you happen to catch that lunch and learn or that speaker? Like, I didn't know that they also identified like that, or I didn't know Rosie's family was Italian. Like, we used to eat fried dough for breakfast too at my grandma's house. Like, that connection.
Yeah.
That oh, at the core of this were people. Um, and and that is my favorite part about equity trainings. I will say in the statewide equity office, we really are looking at systemic policy, legislative change that we can do to help marginalized communities. And so I go back to community informed decisions. One of the things that we did in the statewide equity office, my first few months, is we got together a stakeholder group of small business owners. And very, very intentionally, we said we need people from all marginalized backgrounds, Hispanic owned businesses, Black American owned businesses, disabled veteran owned businesses, etc. And we brought them into a room, and we brought procurement state officials into a room. And let's have a conversation about supplier diversity. What is working when it comes to state contracts? What's not working when it comes to state contracts? And what can we do about it? And so this was one of my.
Was that one of those? I just wish I could have been right as a small woman of like. I wish I could have been in that room because I would imagine, like on the state side, there was probably this.
Oh my gosh, it was such a cool coordination of efforts for people to really understand each other. And I think, again, that's the core of equity, diversity, and inclusion is it's like, how can we understand each other more? And so that group inspired our communities of practice. And we've got to do this as much as possible. And so through that community of practice, those small business owners put together an entire recommendations report for the Department of Personnel Administration and for potential legislative measures that we can move forward for those small businesses, all completely informed by them. And so a few things that are coming out of that recommendations report, which I would encourage anybody to take a look at, is on our DPA website. But we're looking at things like EDIA plans for contractors. So when you are submitting a bid to a contract, we know that EDI is also important to you. We are looking at the definitions of small businesses across the state. I have a question for you now. How big or small do you think you have to be considered a small business within the state?
I don't know within the state federally, like for our codes, it's like 150 million before we're not considered a small business.
In the state of Colorado right now, you have to have 500 employees or less. And so that is not necessarily the most level of playing grounds for everyone. And so we're looking at things like that. And that was all informed by this stakeholder group. And through this recommendations report, which will then hopefully affect policies and legislation and things like that, this then creates economic growth for small business owners, which creates healthier and better communities, which creates, you know, more robust families and neighborhoods and friends and families. And it's just so cool to watch. It is so cool to watch. And so those are, so I would say in terms of what's working, community, 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 instead of making decisions based on what you think a community needs, ask the community themselves because they know the best.
And trust. I think
And
there's
trust.
two parts there, right? Because boy, I know the horror stories of we're gonna go and we're gonna have these forums and we're gonna have the conversation. Is that really what they need? Right? Like there's sort of the savior piece that comes in. And so I love that what y'all have done is not just asking and having this, but then trusting.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And
Yes.
Because what, right, we hear all the time, like, trust us. There was, um, uh, I sat in on a panel, of students, college
Mhm.
students from marginalized, and they were talking about, you know, how if you just gave us a tiny bit of money, we know what to do with it.
Right.
Like we know what we need, right? We know what we could do to create a student organization. Like now we're, you know, we're doing it because we're all chipping in and but the overarching theme there was trust us. We know what we need.
100%. When I lived in Namibia as a Peace Corps volunteer, uh, we had this room at the school, and it was probably the nicest room in all of the school. It wasn't probably, it was. And it was full when I walked in, it was full of like 15 computers, not on desks, but all around the floor, all in boxes, stacked up, this, that. They had even installed an AC unit in the room for the computers. And I finally, you know, through some conversations I had with kiddos and teachers, well, what's going on with the computer lab, or what it, they said, well, there was this great nonprofit that came in and they donated all these computers to us, but we don't have the functionality. We don't have enough outlets. We don't have enough power sources, and we don't have anybody to teach computer literacy. And so it was another kind of like, okay, well, great intentions, incredible intentions, but maybe if there were a few more conversations beforehand, it would have led to different efforts. And so those computers had never been used.
It's such a that should be like a short story that everybody who calls themselves an ally needs. um, what do you see as next? What does the future hold?
Mm, progress. So much progress to be made. One of the things that I would really love to see the DEIA community embrace, and I think practitioners are there, but I think a big next, not next step, but current step that people are hopefully gravitating towards is language access.
Mm.
Um, you know, language access and language justice is crucial, because if we do not allow for all residents, for the state or all residents of our communities to be a part of the conversation, and we continue to put up barriers to having them be a part of the conversation, that's another way of silencing people.
Mhm.
And so that is a huge space that I think there can be a lot of progress in. It's a really interesting space to be in diversity, equity, and inclusion right now. But it is so, as challenging as the work can be, it is so joyful. It
Yeah.
is so, so joyful. And I hope that practitioners and people that are really embracing, and people that aren't embracing or just new to it or whatever, wherever you are on your continuum of learning, understand that this is really joyful work.
It is joyful work, right? Like it's
Yeah.
so, I think a lot of times we talk about the hard and we talk
Yeah.
about, and we talk about the, the setbacks and the
Right.
challenges but the joy is so real.
Oh, it's incredible. When our team wins, I feel like all of humanity wins. I'm like,
Totally. Yes. Like,
yes.
what happened?
Yes.
Um, will you leave me with one last truth bomb?
Yes, I wrote this one down for you because I think it is so important. Um, DEIA, DEIB is not a fad. My lived experience as a woman of color is not a fad. As long as there are people being marginalized, silenced, and invalued in this world, in this country, DEIA, DEIB is not going anywhere. Um, I won't say that we have too much to lose. I'll say that we've had too much that's been lost.
Mhm.
So that would be my truth bomb.
We're sticking around.
We're not going anywhere.
Well, and I think what is interesting, just what you were saying, Rosie, about language, right? And like I think there are always new, not new. I think that the like what we focus on, what we attend to, the elements that we're bringing in and considering. I think that part is exciting too, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not going away, and we just keep getting clearer pictures of, gosh, have we, accessibility, people weren't using an A. And most people in the disability community will tell you it's still an afterthought in most organizations.
Mhm.
And so I think even right, and then language, and I think that's a part of both the hell and the joy. Not going away, and there's just this rich um playing field isn't the right word, right? But we'll just keep adding and getting better at
Yeah.
at our approach. So
And
yeah.
that's what I think is so cool to watch is there's
Mhm.
so many different approaches to the work. And to see again, I see it in our team all the time, the passion and the heart and sometimes the tears, but also the joy behind what we do
Yeah.
is so contagious and inspiring.
Well,
And
I have to say, after sitting in a room with some of your team, anybody that is a part of this community and watching, y'all, we are lucky that Rosie and her team are leading this at the state level, because there's brilliance and there's heart and there's expertise and commitment. So it's like a dream team at the
I
state
have to
level.
agree, Mel. Well
So
said.
thank you so much. Thank you for sharing the four pillars, how you're listening, how you're centering voices. There was so much in here. And I'm really glad that you took the HR role at the fashion
I
that
know.
right.
Who knew?
And it was destiny. I want to see that picture of little 8-year-old you in front of all your aunts because
I'll send it your way.
I love that inspiration. Rosie, thank you, thank you, thank you. To the rest of you, let's make this 2024 one that we look back and say, look at the progress. Look at the progress that we made. I can't wait for all the conversations that we have this year. In the meantime, get out there and do the next right thing. And we will see you next time on Everyday Inclusion Live. Bye, y'all.